When I was in the 9th grade, I had a group of friends that I hung out with almost every day. We lived in a small town, and there wasn't a lot for kids our age to do. We often ended up just wandering around, looking for places to chill. Our town had a small retail area, with a shopping mall, a few stores, and a restaurant that had a decent-sized parking lot. There were a lot of lights, and they stayed on all night. Our school was only a few hundred feet away from there, so it was where we would hang out pretty much all the time. The whole town closed down at around 8 p.m., so after then, it was basically a ghost town, just me and my friends wandering around. Since everyone knew each other, our parents were okay with it. One night, we found ourselves in the parking lot of a restaurant when it was closed. It was one of those family-owned places. We all went to eat there pretty regularly. At the time, though, it was just a spot to sit and hang. There were 3 of us out that night. It was me, Jake, and Sarah. We were sitting on the curb sharing jokes and stories, occasionally laughing a bit too loud. That's when it happened. An old car pulled into the parking lot. It was rusted at the edges, making a low rumbling noise. The headlights were dim, casting a weak glow over the pavement as it slowly approached us. We all went quiet, watching the car with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. It wasn't common to see other people around at that hour, especially not in a car that looked like it belonged in a junkyard. We would have remembered a car like that if we'd seen it before, but we didn't. I didn't anyway. The car stopped a few feet away from us. The smell of burned gasoline was overpowering. The window rolled down, and the driver turned to us. He was an older guy, with scruffy facial hair and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. There was something about him that set off alarm bells in my head. He didn't look very friendly, or like he was sizing us up, figuring out something in his head.
"Hey kids,"
he called out in a raspy voice.
"You know you're not supposed to be here after close, right?"
None of us moved. We just stared at him, unsure what to do. This wasn't something we'd ever encountered before. Stranger danger was something that we'd been taught in school, but it was a different experience in real life.
"The owner sent me to make sure nobody was trespassing. Hop in, and I'll take you home."
That's when the feeling in my stomach turned from discomfort to outright fear. We knew the owner, and we knew he would never do something like that. The guy in the car had never shown his face in our town before anyway. The story made no sense, and I don't think I was the only one who noticed. I grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her up. "We have to go," I whispered. Jake seemed to agree, and he stood up to go as well. The man watched us stand, his expression turning sour.
"Suit yourself, but I'm gonna have to tell your parents,"
he grumbled. But thankfully, he didn't get out of the car. We didn't stick around to hear anything else that he had to say. As a group, we started walking quickly away from the parking lot, glancing back to make sure he wasn't following. Once we were a good distance away, we broke into a run. We didn't stop until we reached the main street. We were out of breath and scared. None of us spoke for a few minutes. We just stood there. Finally, Jake broke the silence. "That was messed up," he said. We all agreed and discussed what happened for a few minutes. We were all shaken up pretty bad. The consensus was clear that we'd been lucky to get away. Eventually, we ended up at Sarah's house. Her parents were still awake, and we told them everything. They were concerned, of course, and her dad immediately called the police to report it. The police came and talked to us for a bit. They were kind, and they reassured us that we had done the right thing by running away and telling an adult. The police then called the owner of the restaurant to make sure he hadn't actually sent the guy. Sure enough, he confirmed that he had no idea who the man was. That made sense because he never had a problem with us hanging out there before. They searched our streets for the rest of the night, but the car was not found. For the next week at school, it was all anybody talked about. Once word got around, 2 more kids came forward with similar stories. For whatever reason, they never told anybody until then. I don't know if they were scared of getting in trouble, or maybe they didn't think it was a big deal at the time. Knowing that made it even scarier. There was some creep prowling our streets for at least a few weeks, and we didn't even know. Lucky for us, the man never came back as far as I know. Predators can be pretty clever. My guess is that he knew the cops were looking for him. The guy probably moved on to another town. I wish the best for them. This happened when I was in my 2nd year of college. I worked at a restaurant that was just off campus. 2 of my friends worked there as well, and one of them was my roommate at the time. It was a pretty laid-back job for the most part. The manager was pretty cool, and he spent most of his time hanging out at the bar with the customers. That left us to do pretty much whatever we wanted. I was a server, and so were both my friends. The place was pretty fancy. It was right on a small lake that was in our city, and it had a great view. The prices were way too high for us college students, but that usually meant that the tips were pretty good as well. I was working the late shift on a Friday night. The place was open until 2 a.m. on Fridays, but the kitchen closed at 9 p.m., so most of the servers got to go home earlier. I was allowed to serve drinks though, so I was the one who stayed. My two friends went home at around 9:30. The night had been busy. We'd had a couple of late dinner reservations, but things really took off later on. The place turned into more of a party bar after that, and Fridays were busy. At around 1:30, things were winding down. At one point, I went to the back to throw out some trash. The garbage area was surrounded by a tall wooden fence, but I could see through the wooden planks. The parking lot was on the other side. I looked out, and I could see a single guy standing on the far corner of the parking lot. He was leaning against the fence, right under a streetlight. I wasn't too concerned at first. I thought he was just drunk, common occurrence. Even though the place was busy, there were not many cars there, probably because everyone was drinking, and the place was right on a major bus route. We finished closing up the restaurant and locked it up. It was just the manager and I at the time. My car was parked on one side, and the manager's was on the other, so we went our separate ways. I made my way across the parking lot. When my car came into view, I saw something that made my heart skip a beat. There was a man crouched down behind my vehicle. I couldn't see his face, but the sight of someone hiding sent a jolt of fear through me. It was difficult to make out much through the 2 panes of glass, but I immediately suspected it was the guy who I saw earlier. As soon as I regained my composure, I turned around and went over to where my manager's car was. Luckily, he was standing next to his car having a cigarette. I rushed towards him. "There's someone behind my car," I whispered, trying to keep my voice calm. My manager put out his smoke, and we both got into his car. Once inside, he locked all the doors and pulled out his phone to call the cops. My manager was speaking to the dispatcher, giving them our location and a quick rundown of what was happening. He was composed, but I could tell he was scared too. He kept glancing out the windows, making sure nobody was around. We couldn't see my car from there, so we didn't know if he was still next to it. The wait for the police felt like a long time. Finally, 2 police cruisers appeared. 2 officers got out and talked to us for a minute. The other car went over to where my car was. I couldn't see what was happening over there, but at one point, I heard someone yell out, "Drop it." Eventually, the cops walked over. They had a man in handcuffs. His head was down, and his long hair was covering most of his face. They put him into the back of their car and came to talk to us. The 2 cops confirmed what I already knew. The man was crouched down behind my car. Apparently, the flashing blue and red lights didn't even scare him off. What really scared me, though, was what they told me next. When the cops approached the guy, he was holding a broken glass bottle in one of his hands. It was a wine bottle or some kind of a liquor bottle, broken in a way that it was really like a weapon. When the guy came out, he was holding it up towards the cops. Fortunately, they were able to get him to put it down without using their firearms. After it was all over, the cops walked me back to my car. When I walked over to the driver's side door, there were scratches all over it. Looked like somebody was trying to write something, but it was way too messy to read. I guess that guy did it with the bottle. In any case, it was a really scary night for me. I never found out exactly what happened to the man, and I don't know how dangerous he really was. Judging by what I saw, he seemed pretty crazy. I bet he was capable of anything. I used to work the night shift at a fast food restaurant, a job I had been doing for about a year at that time. I quit soon after this took place, which was almost 10 years ago. It's been a while, but I remember every detail of these events. It was a rainy night in the fall, not quite freezing rain, but not far off. It was the kind of night where you really don't want to be out. The temperature was probably just a few degrees above freezing. Our restaurant only kept the drive-thru open at night. That meant that it was just me working. It was around 1 a.m. by then, and I would see a few customers per hour. It had been a while since anybody came in though, and I was feeling tired. I was having a hard time keeping my eyes open. That's when I saw a car pull into the parking lot. It was an old sedan, nothing remarkable about it, but it caught my attention because it was the first sign of life I had seen in a while. I watched as a man got out. He was tall, and he wore a hooded jacket which covered his face. He was walking towards the front door. Some people don't realize that the inside is closed at night, so I figured he would get the idea and come back around to the drive-thru. But then, I started to hear a pounding at the front door. This guy must not have been the brightest among us, I thought. It went on for a solid minute, and then I decided to go and tell him. I walked through the dining area and to the front door, preparing to explain that he'd need to use the drive-thru, but when I was close, he stopped. As soon as I turned the corner to see the front door, the man was walking away. I shrugged it off and went back to my station, expecting the car to pull up soon. From where I was sitting, I could see the sedan, but it wasn't moving. I kept an eye on it, but after another 5 minutes, it still hadn't moved from its spot. Something about this didn't sit right with me. It was just sitting there, engine off, in the empty lot. The rain was still coming down, and it was cold outside. I couldn't understand where that guy could be. He must have been soaked and freezing out there. After another half hour, I decided to take a smoke break. The night was dragging on, and I needed something to break the boredom. I stepped outside, taking shelter under the small section of roof that covered the perimeter of the building. I propped open the door with a doorstop and stood there, back to the wall. The night was cold, and I wanted to finish my smoke and go back inside. But as I stood there, I glanced over at the sedan. It was odd the way that it sat there. A nagging thought tugged at the back of my mind. Why would somebody park there and not come to the drive-thru? Why did he walk up to the door and then disappear? There weren't any stores around there. It's not like he was using us for free parking or anything. It simply made no sense to me at the time. Out of pure curiosity, I decided to take a closer look. I crushed my cigarette under my shoe and walked towards the car. I walked around it for a minute. The rain was starting to soak through my clothes, so I decided to head back. I turned around to the building, and that's when I saw him. The guy from the car was standing next to the door, which was still propped open. I didn't know what to do. I wondered if that guy was just out there waiting for me the whole time, lingering next to the building. The next thing I knew, the man walked into the door, then kicked the doorstop and locked me out. There I was, stuck out in the rain, while some random stranger took over the building. I was responsible for that place, and let some crazy guy get in. I took out my phone and dialed the cops. For some reason, it took them over 20 minutes to arrive, even though we weren't that far from the station. Once they pulled up, I told them what happened and that the guy was still in there. I had a view of both exits, and the car was still there too, so I knew he was inside. 4 or 5 cops went in soon later. They came out with the guy in handcuffs. They put him into the back of one of the squad cars and took him away. When I went back into the restaurant, I couldn't believe what I saw. The place was absolutely trashed. Food was thrown all over the floor. Ketchup and other condiments splattered everywhere. I walked around for a few minutes, checking out the damage. When I got to the back room though, the smell hit me. The guy smeared crap all over the wall of our stock room. I backed out right away and closed the door. By that time, it was past 2 a.m., and I was in no mood to deal with it. I called my boss, waking him up in the middle of the night. There was no way that we could keep that place open for the rest of my shift. It wouldn't be sanitary. I was given the go-ahead to close for the night. My next shift wasn't until a few days later. I don't know the exact details of how the place got cleaned up, but I think my boss took one for the team. Creepy as it was, it would have been even worse if he got in while I was there. The guy must have been crazy, and I don't even want to think about what could have happened if I was in there with him. A few years ago, I worked at a diner that was just off the highway. It was a simple, unassuming place, typically frequented by truckers and locals. One evening, something happened that I still think about to this day. It was a Tuesday, which I remember because Tuesdays were always slow. The diner was empty, just me and the cook Hank in the back. I was the manager, and I was also the server at the time. As I was wiping down the counters, I noticed a car pull into the parking lot. It was an older car, and it caught my attention because the driver just parked and sat there without getting out. We were still open, but it was getting late. It was only an hour and a half until close, so I was hoping that if he was going to come in, then he'd hurry. After about 5 minutes, the man came into the restaurant. He was literally the only customer. The man sat at a table in the far corner and ordered a coffee. He also asked if we had beer, but our place was not licensed to serve alcohol, so we didn't. I continued to clean the place slowly as the man sat there nursing his coffee. After about 45 minutes, he paid his bill and went out to his car, but he didn't leave. He just sat there in the driver's seat, didn't even turn on the engine. At first, I didn't think much of it. Maybe he was checking for directions or sending a text. But after half an hour, I started to feel uneasy. The car just sat there, the man barely moving. Part of me wanted to go outside and check if everything was alright, but I also didn't want to make a fuss over potentially nothing. The car stayed in the lot for what must have been over an hour. Eventually, Hank came out from the kitchen, and I pointed it out to him. He suggested that the person might be waiting for someone, or lost. It seemed plausible, so I tried to push my worries aside. Then out of nowhere, the place was swarmed with cop cars. The sound of sirens was deafening, and the lights almost gave me a seizure. Hank and I watched out the window as the man was dragged out of his car and arrested. He was placed in the back of one of the cars, then 2 officers entered our restaurant. Hank and I stood there in disbelief as they approached us. The cops started out by asking us simple questions, like how long he had been there. After that was out of the way, I gathered the courage to ask what had happened. That's when I found out that the man was a suspect in a robbery that took place earlier in the night. The scariest part is that somebody was actually shot. We didn't know for sure if the guy was the shooter, but that's what I thought at the time. That's pretty much the end of it. I was basically alone with a violent criminal for almost an hour. In that time, he could have done anything to me, but for whatever reason, he didn't. I don't know what was going through his head, but I'm just glad he didn't try anything on me. This all occurred on January 21st of 2019. I was 24 and I was a waitress at a restaurant in Ohio. I came into work like any other day to open. My first table was 2 people, a man and a woman, who I'll call Dale and Sarah. I seated them and proceeded to take their drink orders. They both ordered drinks from the bar and some soda. When I came back with their drinks, they complimented my name, which is Mara. They were telling me how unique and beautiful it was, which I get all the time, so it wasn't weird to me. I asked if they were ready to order any appetizers, and they ordered 2 different ones. As I was going to step away to put in their order, Dale asked me if I had a boyfriend. I said yes. Dale said,
Of course, a beautiful girl has a boyfriend.
He continued to tell me how beautiful I was. Dale then told me that he and Sarah were just friends. When I came back with their appetizers, I saw that I had another table to tend to right next to them. I started talking to the other table. Dale and Sarah tried to get my attention. Dale was pulling at my skirt. I ignored it, thinking it was rude of him. When I came back to Dale and Sarah, Dale asked if I found Sarah attractive. I found that to be a very strange question to ask your waitress, but I didn't want to be rude because I wanted to tip, so I answered yes. He then proceeded to grab my waist and pull me close to him. I felt my face go beet red. I laughed out of nervousness and moved away from him. Dale and Sarah both laughed, and I walked away to check my other tables. When I went back to give them their entrees and another round of beer, they proceeded to get more inappropriate. Dale asked me if I'd ever had a threesome. I didn't answer, and when I didn't, he asked me if I wanted to have one with them. Again, my face went beet red, and I just walked away. I went to tell my manager. He asked me how big the bill was so far. I said it was around $70. My manager then told me that they were almost done eating, and to ignore it until they were done. He didn't want to kick them out because of how much they were ordering. I said okay, and went back to tend their table. By that time, they had been there for 3 hours. They took up most of my time, considering we were only open for dinner, which was 6 hours. I had to give up some tables because they wouldn't stop talking to me, 15 minutes non-stop, and when I tried to walk away, Dale would either grab my waist or my hand. Sarah then asked what time we closed. I said 10. Again, they asked for more beer. Sarah then asked if I would come home with them after I was off. I replied no thank you. Dale was begging me, saying we could have a threesome and that it would be fun. I was so disgusted with them by that time, and told another waiter to drop off their check. When the other waiter came back to the kitchen, he told me they wanted to ask me something before they paid. so of course I went out there, just so they would pay and leave. Sarah and Dale both told me that they would come back at closing and get me from work. My heart dropped, and I rushed back to the kitchen. I told my manager I'm not going back out there until they're gone. My manager then went back out to grab their payment, but they were no longer there. They left without paying or tipping on a $90 bill. I was so angry because I had to give up tables for them. Dale kept grabbing me and forcing me to stay, talking to me for 15 minutes throughout the night. They wouldn't let me leave their table. At the end of the night, I asked one of the kitchen guys to walk me to my car. Thank God Sarah and Dale were nowhere in sight. After this day, I learned to speak up and no longer let people walk all over me or take advantage of me in any way.